Answer this hypothetical in a comment below, if you will. If you were trapped on a mountaintop with your best friend, with nothing to eat for the weeks ahead, would you starve with them? Or would you perhaps make a human-flavored snack of your friend? Well, if you chose to devour them, you might have just cursed yourself to the life of a Wendigo, a creature possessed by a dark spirit that has been transformed into a monster with endless hunger. Today, I've got some allegedly real stories about Wendigo that will make both your heart and stomach sink. If you have a scary story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org. And if you'd rather listen to the show while you sleep, work, drive, or exercise, follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and iTunes. And if you could, please leave a review on iTunes too to help us grow. Thank you. Links are in the description. Now, let's feast. A quick warning. All of today's stories feature animals preying upon other animals. The Mourning Hill, from Woosh. I'm in my mid-40s now, but way back when I was born and raised, I grew up on a country farm. My family and I lived in the South. I spent a lot of time with my parents. My mom stayed home, and my father only worked a couple of days of the week. When he wasn't working, my dad would spend a lot of time farming. He spent years trying to perfect his corn crop. As for me, when I wasn't at school or I wasn't hanging with friends or helping my dad, you could probably find me on top of the nearby hill. A hill I call the Mourning Hill. You'll soon understand why. This big green hill overlooked the farm and the nearby rolling forests. During the spring and summer, the hill was soft and cushy, and on clear days it was especially warm, so it was the perfect napping spot. I was mostly an active kid, but I often did find myself in need of a nap, so you'd find me in the afternoon on that hill on many occasions. But this experience did not happen to me on the hill. One night, my family and I were in our rooms in the house. We were sleeping. It must have been well after midnight. I awoke first to the sound of my dad, who had entered my room and asked me why I was crying. I rubbed my eyes and yawned real big. I asked him what he meant, though he didn't need to answer. Firstly, the look on his face made me realize that he knew now that it wasn't me that was crying. And secondly, I soon heard the crying sound for myself. It was easy to hear from my room, as I like to keep the windows open. The typical sounds of the night often help me fall asleep. Even if the night is cold, I prefer the windows open. But this sound was not typical, nor was it comforting.
Whoosh, go to our bedroom,
my dad requested of me. Plenty creeped out already, I obeyed. I leapt out of bed and jogged to my mom and dad's room. My mom was awake in bed, just listening. I curled up next to her and waited. We watched as my dad came to the room, grabbing the old locked case from the closet where he kept his rifle. Now armed, he went outside after shushing us. We could hear him from that bedroom open and close the front door. Step after cautious and slow step, we heard him round the house, until he was on the same side of the house where my favorite hill was. My mother slowly got up and tiptoed to the window. The blinds at her window were transparent, but not enough, so she began to open them and tie them up so that we could watch through the window. Pale moonlight cascaded through the glass and hit the wood floors, and I swear, when I looked up and saw the silhouette on the hill, I got goosebumps. There was a human shape, only a bit bigger than a child. The figure sat on top of my hill, sprawled out in an overdramatic way. Imagine the way an edgy or melodramatic teenager might throw themselves into their bed after a rough day. That's how they were lying there in the moonlight. From what I could see, Their skin was extremely pale, mostly gray with perhaps a touch of blue to it. The parts of their arms that didn't blend in with the rest of the silhouette seemed really thin, immediately reminding me of the old magazines I saw depicting starving children in Africa. I could see a malnourished chest rising and falling as the thing wept.
Hey!
My dad had found the silhouette too. He stood at the bottom of the hill, gun pointing down, shouting a warning towards the figure.
Y'all need something?
My dad was a cautious yet confident man. He wouldn't point a gun at someone unless he knew they were trouble and they were threatening him. That's why he still had the gun pointing down to the ground. Immediately, the figure reacted to the sound of my dad's voice. It shot up into a crouching position, revealing its bald head and a much more angular skull shape. It may have been nearly the size of a child, but it was hardly shaped like a human, more like a sheet of skin draped over chiseled bone. I'd never seen anything like it before, and it made chills go up and down my spine. My mom, who was now back in bed and holding on to me, she began to grip me tighter and closer. I'd never seen her so scared, and for the first time in my life, I began to wonder if my dad was going to make it out of this. But I quickly reminded myself that my dad was much bigger than this thing, and he had a gun. A gun that my father was now aiming at the silhouette, meaning my dad was just as scared. I wondered then what he could see being so much closer to it than us. Then it all happened at once.
The hell?
The creature growled. My dad fired the gun. A puff of dirt shot into the air as my dad missed, and the creature shot off at remarkable speed into the opposite side of the hill. My dad hesitated a moment before running up the hill, peering down when he made it to the top. I watched him scratch his head. After a few seconds, he looked towards the window where he saw us watching, and he shook his head. Then he began to walk back inside. The door opened and closed once again. I heard him take the time to lock it. Then heavy, cautious footsteps came back to the master bedroom. My dad walked in with a sigh and began to lock the rifle back in its case. "Jeffrey, what on earth was that?" My mother demanded to know.
Dunno.
He replied. There was a lot of concern in his voice. My dad may not say much when he talks, but it's easy to see what emotion he has when he does. At least for us it was.
Best not be going out alone for a while.
My mother nodded. Then he looked at me dead in the eyes.
You hear me, boy?
I began to nod repeatedly as fast as I could. He sounded mad, but I could tell he was just worried. I remember that night being kind of cold, but my dad's face was drenched in sweat and pale. That alone scared the heck out of me as a kid. For the next few months, we did as my dad said. None of us would go out alone, not even my dad, as far as I knew anyway. And I began to be too afraid to go nap on that hill, even in the middle of the day. As the encounter became more and more distant and time went by, I decided to ask my dad what he saw that night. He was sitting in the kitchen, cleaning his rifle the night after a hunt. He cut his eyes at me, then smirked.
Gray little thing it was. Bit bigger than you, boy. Little blue veins throbbing through its skin. No fur, no hair all over it. Just as smooth as it could be if it weren't for the bones popping out. Looked fragile, it did. But it sure did have a mouth on it. Really didn't want that thing to bite me. Crawled away too fast to be real. But I saw it, and when I went up there, it was already gone, despite there being acres of clearing before the trees start. There weren't nothing left on that hill that night. But the next morning, just before y'all was awake, I went out alone, even though I told y'all not to. Well, went to the hill, and it seems that thing came back. Must have been a dozen dead squirrels up there. Couple of possums, too. Something had sat there and piled them up, started to gnaw at them, and when it was done, it crawled away, leaving all the remains.
That was the most I've ever heard him talk in one sitting, and each bit of what he had to say about that night scared me all over again. Ever since then, I wondered what it could have been. We never did see it again, and I didn't hear Dad talk about it ever again either. So as far as I know, no more dead animals showed up on the property. So what it was, your guess is as good as mine. But what me and my mother saw, and what my dad encountered himself, I think we all knew that very night that it wasn't human. It ruined our lives. From Lady Storm 24. I grew up in the early 70s and my family was extremely poor. My parents' parents were poor and their parents were poor, and as far back as it went, my family has lived in poverty. Luckily for us, the home we lived in was passed down generation after generation. It wasn't much more than a cabin, but it was something to have shelter in, something to grow up in and around. Well, my mom and dad were the first of our family members to own something beyond just the house. As we were all tired of being poor, my father and mother invested in a chicken house. They didn't actually own the chickens they raised. Rather, they were provided chickens by a company, and when they were big enough, the chickens would be shipped back to the company, and my family would be paid based on the weight of the chickens and the number of the chickens. So it was extremely important that the chickens were healthy and well protected. We had a lot of coyotes around those parts, so whenever they got too brave, my dad would stay up in the night, shooting any coyotes he saw that got too close. Eventually, they'd be afraid for another few months or even a year or so. Back then, I went to school in the day and worked all afternoon once I got home. That was just how life was. Most of the time, I would be helping my dad maintain the chicken house. We'd have to make sure the chickens weren't too warm, but were warm enough. If they overheated, they'd fall over dead. We had to make sure they had enough food, enough water, had to keep the water and grounds clean, all that. And every day, my dad would walk through the entire length of the chicken house, which was pretty long, several hundred feet, I think, and he would be keeping an eye out for dead chickens. Each one meant money out of his pocket, and decaying bodies of chickens could endanger the other chickens that were still alive. It was unsanitary, after all. If I wasn't at school or working at the chicken house, I was helping my mom tend to the garden. We had a big garden that took up almost all the property we owned. We also had a milk cow, a couple of goats, and a different breed of chicken that we kept for personal use, mostly for eggs and on occasion for chicken meat. We had about a dozen of those. Well, when I turned around 11 years old, something happened that year that changed our lives forever, for the worse. I think it was a Saturday, which meant waking up with Dad and helping him with the chicken house. I was a little late getting started. It's rough waking up at 6 a.m. as a kid. Most of the time, my mom or dad had to drag me out of bed. I was a few minutes behind him, so when I met him at the chicken house, he was just standing outside of it. He hadn't gone in yet. He had his arms on his hips and he looked exasperated. I heard him curse under his breath, and then I saw what he was looking at. A big old pile of dead, half-eaten chickens. It was the most dead chickens we had had all at once since starting the chicken farm. All in all, I think there were 14 dead chickens. My dad was red in the face, angry and confused. He walked around the building looking for openings where a predator may have gotten in and had his pick of the litter of a chicken buffet. Strangely enough, the chicken house was completely intact. There were no openings, no holes, nothing of the like. And my father knew he had closed the doors the previous night. But he had a hunch as to what happened. We didn't keep locks on the chicken house doors. We lived way out in the country, so locks weren't really necessary. My dad's guess was someone got into the chicken house, and when they left the door open, allowing coyotes to get in, dragging out chickens to eat. After all, a human wouldn't just bite into a chicken raw like that. Why the doors were now closed was probably due to the wind pushing them back shut sometime during the night or morning, which was a blessing because the coyotes could have gotten even more chickens, or the chickens could have escaped. That made sense to me. Nights were beginning to get pretty cold, so if some homeless person saw a chicken house filled with big heaters that kept the chickens warm, he would walk right in if he could. Going with this assumption, my father later went to the hardware store to purchase some padlocks. After a long and stressful day, we made sure to lock up tight and to keep the key to the padlocks somewhere safe in our own home. The following Sunday morning, my dad was met with a sight that made him more and more indignant. I had never seen him so mad. The doors were shut and still locked, but there was a hole in the side of the wall of the chicken house, and next to the hole were another 8 chicken bodies, which were also half-eaten. I remember saying to my dad almost right away when I saw that, "I didn't know coyotes could dig through a wall like that." Without looking at me, shaking his head, my father replied, "I don't think they can, honey." So my dad didn't believe it was coyotes. I asked him, "So, was it a person?" "Darling, I don't know. Why don't you run back up to the house with your mom, okay? Take the morning off. Just, make sure you're ready for church later, okay?" With an excited "yes, sir," I ran right back up to the house, sleeping in until Mom made some eggs and squash. I didn't really think about it then, but I think my dad didn't want me around the chicken house at the time. I understand now that that was the beginning of my dad's suspicion and fear. My dad spent the remainder of the morning before church fixing the hole in the wall. I could tell when he came back up to the house to shower and get ready for church that he didn't really want to leave the house. But my mom made sure he came to church with us, if not to just relax for a while. If left to his own devices, my dad would stress himself sick, even on a good day. A couple of hours later, when we were coming back, the chicken house was in one piece and everything was fine, for now. That night, though, my dad decided to stay up and sit in a lawn chair by the chicken house. He took his shotgun with him, and he told me and my mom not to wait up. I remember right before I went to bed, I checked out the screen door and looked all the way down the road to where the chicken house was, and I saw my dad circling it. He was literally patrolling around the chicken house, back and forth in a long circle to cover the whole distance of the chicken house. That man was going to be tired in the morning, I thought. Makes me realize now just how much my dad went through to make sure we could live, that we could eat, that I could go to school and church. I really miss my dad, and I wish he was still around so I could tell him thank you. Anyway, back to the story. Somehow, during the night, even though my dad patrolled until sunup, something had gotten in with the chickens while he was on the opposite side of the building, meaning whatever it was able to pry open a square piece of sheet metal, one of many that made up the chicken house, and get inside. And this thing was smarter than I thought it was, because instead of dragging chicken bodies out in the open to feast, it ran around as quickly as it could inside the chicken house, killing and devouring what it could in the short amount of time it took my dad to run inside after getting the locks open. Chickens are real loud when they're panicked, so my dad knew right away that something was wrong. But by the time he made it inside, he saw a flash of the creature and 5 dead chickens with big chunks taken out of them. A trail of blood and feathers led out of the structure, helping my dad ascertain which piece of the sheet metal had been pulled loose. Outside, the trail led into the nearby ditch, and it stopped in the woods. My dad swears he saw a light gray shape bounding through the undergrowth as he heard twigs snapping underneath as it ran. At the time, he didn't know what it was, but his running theory at that point was that it was a larger feral dog, something with jaws strong enough to pull back sheet metal, and to tear up 5 chickens in that short of a time span. Maybe that's just what he told us. The way my dad behaved after that incident, and the one before it, made me think he was beginning to feel more and more scared for our safety. The days went on like this. We lost more and more chickens, no matter what my dad did. Barricading the chicken house, patrolling, planting traps. This animal was able to get in, was able to destroy and devour our livestock. And by the time the next pickup for the chickens came around, my family suffered a huge loss. The loan they had taken out for the chicken house structure could not be paid back for the next few months, and because that meant several missed payments, the collateral they used to get the loan originally was at risk. As things continued, we got to the point we were about to lose our home and land. One night, I woke up. I was so exhausted still. I didn't know what time it was or why I'd been awakened. I remember stretching and yawning real big and looking around the room. Everything was so dark. Shadows were being cast by the moon outside. My little art mannequin, which had been gifted to me by a cousin a few years back, cast the biggest shadow of all, as it was the closest thing to my window. The way the mannequin's oversized shadow hit the other corner of my room made it look like there was something moving around over there, something vaguely human in shape. As my eyes got less blurry and I became more aware from waking up, I noticed there was a chill in my room and a draft. My bedroom window was open. I stared at the corner of the room where the shadows danced. I grew wide-eyed when I saw eyes looking back at me. Those weren't dancing shadows. No. There was a humanoid figure kneeling in my room, and it was crawling around. Now it was watching me, and appeared to be crawling slowly towards me. I screamed then, so suddenly and violently, all that came from my mouth was a broken air. I was hyperventilating, and I tried again to scream. This time something came out, and in a matter of seconds, my dad and mom both burst into my room, as a crawling pale gray figure scuttled over my dresser and out the window. Dad ran to get his shotgun. Mom shut and locked the window, staying with me in my room, trying to calm me down as I continued to hyperventilate. At one point, I blacked out. I can't remember if I actually fainted from breathing too hard or if I fell asleep. When I woke up, it was morning. My head was in my mother's lap. My dad sat in a rocking chair in my room. His face was beet red, and there appeared to be dried tears in his eyes. He was a man at the end of his rope. He was desperate and had no idea what else to do. That same day, he would later tell me that that thing appeared to be the same creature or animal that had been attacking and killing our chickens. Something he had come to realize, killed to eat, then continued to kill for the fun of it. Why it had chosen our little homestead, he didn't know. But to him, it was a curse. A random, terrible curse on our family. I wish I could say there was a happy ending. I wish I could say we never saw it again. But these encounters and chicken slaughters continued to happen for the next year, until my family's home was taken away. We moved in with some relatives out of state. We built our lives back up. We continued to go to church. We put as much money into savings as possible, and by the time I was 19, my family was able to own a home again. I worked for the next 6 years living with my parents, partly building a savings for myself and partly giving them what I could to make sure they'd be all right. A few years after that, my dad passed away due to heart failure. I did what I could to supplement her income so we could afford that mortgage, but we lost that home as well. My mother and I moved to the city and lived in a small apartment for a long time. We did end up living in a house again, This one would be permanent for her. Nowadays, I manage a small-town convenience store. And Mom's doing okay. I try to keep her company when I can on the weekends. Not too long ago, when I visited her, we talked about Dad. She told me about how he was before he died. Said he had constant nightmares in his final days. He became more and more wary of unlocked doors and windows. He started talking to Mom about how he felt like a failure to his family, occasionally trying to describe what he remembered of that animal that had ruined our lives. That was all very hard for me to hear. Losing a loved one is bad enough, but hearing that their final moments were stressed, it doesn't put your heart at ease. Something in the Mist, from Darkness Dweller. I come from the north of Italy, and let me tell you, it can be quite foggy here, especially in the Po Valley, which is where I live. A few days ago, I went out for a walk in the morning. On that particular day, the mist was really thick, to the point where I couldn't see more than 10 meters in front of me. I decided not to listen to any music, both because I wanted to enjoy that characteristic atmosphere created by the fog, and because, honestly, I wanted to be as aware of my surroundings as possible. Not that there are any particularly dangerous animals here, but you never know. More or less 1 hour into the walk, which consisted of a series of pathways and trails through the fields, I saw something darting in front of me on all fours. It was too distant for me to actually make out something more than a rough shape. At first, I thought it could be a fox. If I was really unlucky, it might even be a hog. But it didn't seem to notice me, so I wasn't too worried. About 10 minutes later, I saw it again, and again, and again. Every 10 to 15 minutes, I would see it crossing the road in front of me, barely making any noise. On one hand, I thought, I knew I wanted to turn and go back. On the other hand, if I did that, my back would be facing that thing. It would be behind me then, and I didn't like that idea. So I decided to keep moving forward. I was already creeped out, and I preferred to be able to see it, rather than having no idea where it was. After a while, I stepped onto a stretch of road that was paved and passed near some houses, which made me feel a bit safer. Past that, I headed to another trail with a line of trees on either side. The fog there seemed to be even thicker. It was at that point, halfway through the path, that I began to hear a crunching noise somewhere in the distance. I'm not sure if you've ever heard a dog or a cat eating a bird, but it seemed pretty much like that. Stepping onto the grass near the trees, I took a few steps in until I was able to make out a shape crouched in the middle of the trail. It was naked, eating what seemed to be a small rabbit. By then, one would have wisely chose to run the way they came and never look back, which I would have gladly done if I didn't have asthma. Heck, whatever that thing was, it would have surely caught up with me in the span of 200 meters or less, so I decided to do the next best thing. As silently as I could, I hid behind a bunch of trees and bushes, waiting and hoping that that thing wouldn't notice me. After about 10 minutes of listening to that tedious munching, the creature stood up, and for a moment I genuinely thought it was a human. The body structure was the same. It even had hair on its head, but it was way taller than I imagined, and slender to the point where I could make out the shape of every single muscle on its body. What really made me understand that I was not looking at a human being, though, were the hands. Each one of its fingers were elongated and ended in sharp claws. Once I looked up, I noticed that its teeth too were all but human in form. They were as pointy and sharp as those you would see on vampires and TV shows. Something like Supernatural comes to mind. The fact that the creature was dripping in blood now did nothing but make it way more terrifying than it already was. What I consider the weirdest thing about the whole experience, though, is that I'm pretty sure I heard it crying. Not a howling, ear-piercing cry, but instead something that, to my extreme surprise, resembled a human cry. It was so strange and out of place that for a moment I forgot the utter horror of the situation. Luckily, after a few minutes, it took off in the fields to its left. Then I was able, not without scratches, to sneak out of my hiding spot and call someone to come pick me up, because there was no way I'd be able to walk the rest of the way after seeing that. I'm not sure what I saw, and sure as heck I'm not going out walking again if the fog is so dense. I have to admit though, whenever I think about the whole thing, I can't help but wonder why it was crying. Was it some strange way of luring its next prey? Or was it somehow a sense of remorse for what it had done?